Hello and welcome to the Ghoul Guide Association podcast. This episode is part one of our review of the 28 Days Later franchise, where we dive into the British zombie series with a very, very special guest. In this episode, we explore the films 28 Days Later and 28 Weeks Later, and of course, make sure you tune into part two, where we will discuss the latest installment, 28 Years Later.
As usual, there will be spoilers up ahead. And as a content warning, our discussion of the films do touch on domestic violence, sexual violence, and child sexual abuse. So just make sure you're aware of that.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another meeting of the Ghoul Guide Association. We are, of course, as ever, your Ghoul Guides. I'm Lauren.
And I'm Mary.
And today, which you probably have noticed if you are watching on YouTube, we are joined by a very special friend of ours, the goth queen herself, Dr. Kathleen Hudson. Hi, Kathleen.
Hello, how are you?
We are good, thank you. We're very glad to have you here.
I'm very excited to be here.
So if you are not familiar with us and you've not met Kathleen before, Kathleen is a dear friend of ours from our PhD days. We miss her very dearly. She's back in the United States. And we thought for this review, we would have to get her on board because we knew, one, she'd be hysterical, and two, have some very good insights. But Kathleen, do you want to introduce yourself and tell the lovely people of the association what you do and who you are?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Dr. Kathleen Hudson. I did my doctoral work back at the University of Sheffield with Lauren and Mary, so that's how I know them. And now we have our transatlantic relationship and bond. I'm currently an associate professor at Prince George's Community College in Maryland. So I'm sort of the Baltimore, DC area. And not that long ago, I finished editing an edited collection with Mary on religious horror and the eco-gothic, which I think will definitely come up in this conversation.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm just very, very happy to be here and very excited to talk about this movie, about which I have many thoughts. So
yes. And as we will discuss at the end, this film, which I have not seen but know a lot about, touches on a very funny piece of our friendship lore.
Yes.
Yes. But yeah, Kathleen, thank you so much for joining us. We are very glad to have you here. So you've clicked on this episode, I assume, unless it started auto-playing. So you probably know what we're talking about today. But we are doing another review, and we are reviewing the latest installment in the 28 zombie franchise, 28 years later. Mary, do you want to tell the little people, they're not little people, the people a little, about these movies if they are not familiar, or give them a bit of a refresh?
Yeah, so the 28 Days franchise is a British zombie apocalyptic kind of franchise, started way back in 2002 by Danny Boyle and Alex Garland, two excellent kind of, members of British film and also British horror. And that is, I think, another really great reason as to why we both wanted Kathleen here, because this franchise, I think, is very, very British.
Yeah.
All the way through, from the first film to the latest film. And I think that it is interesting and also funny to get an American perspective on that. But also specifically, I know, so we, in our edited collection in the afterword, we did talk about kind of contemporary zombie films, and this film came up a little bit. So I know that Kathleen has a lot of really interesting things to say about this franchise and zombie stuff as well. So yes, it is. I think it is like one of the kind of like 21st century cult zombie films. It's up there.
I think so.
Yeah. It's just being one of the best.
Yeah, and it's very visually iconic. I mean, we were, not to age us, but we were quite young teen/preteens when this came out. And I remember just being horrified by the poster And by that image of Cillian Murphy on the bridge, because as a British person specifically, like, you knew where that was. Like, it was very unsettling to see that. And I do think it was one of those that kind of permeated our teen years, because it was it became a bit of a coming of age film. Not for me, but for everybody else.
Oh, but no, I agree with that, because I feel like it was one of the first horror movies I really watched when I was old enough to watch horror movies. It definitely did get me into the horror movie genre. And it almost in ways didn't feel like a horror movie in some ways, because it was so complex. Yeah. And I'm not a huge zombie movie fan, but it was just so different from everything else that it really did. I think that's one of the things that has, if not necessarily troubled the sequels, but definitely been a factor in the sequels, it changed the game so much that it's kind of hard to replicate that the initial impact of 28 Days Later.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think, I mean, I'm sure, Mary, when you kind of do the run through, you might touch on this, but I think it did really interesting things with the zombie. Obviously things like Resident Evil, both the game and I think the first film had come out by this point, what we thought of as zombies. But the thing that I think has always been quite terrifying about not just 28 Days, but a lot of British horror and British thrillers, things like Day of the Triffids, is the whole Britain being an island, being a relatively small island. What happens when something happens on that island? It's not like something happened on the European continent or in the US, where you've got this vast expanse of land and not necessarily, you know, a border where something can be contained and stopped. And I do think it adds a really interesting layer to it. But Mary, I'll throw back to you to give a little bit of context to what these films actually are about.
Yeah. So I was just thinking there, it might actually be helpful to kind of just explain what makes this different as a zombie film before we get into the film itself. Because I think this is going to be a massive oversimplification, but we can kind of look at, like, I guess, three major strands of zombies in film and media and I'm specifically talking about what we think about as zombies in, like, horror film. So you have the early kind of 20th century kind of voodoo zombies, where they're very much tied to racial narratives and colonial narratives. So films like White Zombie, and there's loads that I have forgotten, but, like, there's loads of these kinds of early, some of them are black and white, where they'll often be set on a plantation, or they might be set in some part of America, and the zombies are either ex-slaves or kind of representative of that kind of enslaved kind of population. And then moving ahead to the 60s, 70s, Kathleen can correct me if I'm wrong with that, but George A. Romero, his kind of zombie films, and especially Day of the Dead, where it kind of shifts it from that kind of voodoo zombie into the undead. So it's these often quite slow moving zombies,
the shambling, aren't they?
Yeah. And they rise up from graves, and you have a lot of those really interesting images. And if you haven't seen it, the hands. Romero's zombie films are iconic. But then what you have in the kind of more contemporary kind of era, and especially with 28 Days Later, is the kind of viral zombie, where it is a contagion. So the zombie virus kind of mutates or is created. You might have a kind of patient, zero, and then they get infected with this virus, and then often it's associated with rage. So in 28 Days Later, it is called the rage virus. Sometimes it's a different kind of virus, but it will make them really aggressive and violent and fast. So these are very fast zombies.
And fast.
And so I think this kind of wave of zombie films what, you know, if you had previously been watching some of the, you know, the earlier zombie films where they were slow or a bit slower, this was a completely different kind of zombie. They were fast. And if you got bitten, then your kind of transformation would be very, very quick. And then you would kind of be transformed into that. And obviously, when I watched this film, I was like, it's like I'm watching The Day of the Triffids as well. And I think it's really interesting. So the Day of the Triffids is a British novel about a kind of killer plant that starts to
it's a genetically mutated plant. It's one of Mary knows it's one of my favorite novels. Don't make me watch it, but I'll read it.
Bad plans.
What I think is really interesting though is that like you can take the beginning of The Day of the Triffids and then the beginning of 28 Days Later and also the beginning of The Walking Dead. So I think the comics came out around a similar time, and I think they both say, you know, we weren't like trying to copy each other, but I think you can say that they were both influenced by Day of the Triffids, which I think is a good way to kind of go into
War of the Worlds to a certain extent as well.
But
and you know, more recent Day of the Triffids and War of the Worlds have kind of like intersected with each other, but that very kind of like everything's going along as normal, everything's very mundane, and then all of a sudden this terrible thing happens that is because of scientific advancements, because that's very clear in Triffids is they've basically been farming the Triffids, and then in the film in one of the most recent films they make them aliens, and I really don't like that because it really removes the whole point of Triffids. But the Triffids essentially are, you know, zombies in a way. They are that like mutant.
But
it's an interesting thing in the context too of the zombies is like an animalistic thing, because it redefines the urban space as sort of a jungle, as a eco landscape, not that's alien. And again, one of the things that was so shocking about 28 Days Later, the thing that everyone remembers is those shots of London completely abandoned, which is very similar, if I recall correctly, to Day of the Triffids and to these other things of like, hey, everyone's gone.
So So the book and the comic, and then later the TV series, and then also 28 Days Later the film, they all start weirdly in the same way, where you have a male protagonist who wakes up in a hospital, and this protagonist has been kind of in a coma for 28 days. In the case of this film, or you know, they've been in there for a period of time, and they wake up and there's no one there. They're in a hospital and there's no one there, and they kind of walk around, and you can see all these scenes of like violence and disruption, but you don't know what's happening. And in 28 Days Later, the protagonist is Cillian Murphy, and he wakes up in a hospital. He's basically a bicycle courier, so he got into a road traffic accident, was in a coma for 20 days, wakes up, and then he, as Kathleen was saying, he walks out into London, and it is deserted. It's deserted. And I think it's just I think that in and of itself is quite a terrifying concept. Like, you're so like, what is this? You know, what's happened? And no one's there to tell you. And
I think it's a very specifically modern fear, I think. And zombies, you could say this of all Gothic monsters, but zombies very specifically transform to fit the fears of the era and the generation. You know, that shift from a racial tension to a psychological tension to a viral tension. And that idea that in a modern world we could, you know, be alone in a space and not know what's going on outside, and no one would tell us, and no one would save us, no one would come for us. You know, that's a very contemporary sort of like post-90s fear that something could be happening and you wouldn't know about it, or you would like not have heard about it. And it does make me think of what's his name, Jared Leto, when he was off on his island with his cult and didn't know that lockdown had happened, and like came back and was like, what do you mean there's a pandemic? that is, I think, something that we get in a lot of contemporary thriller, horror, psychological drama, that idea of walking into a space that should be familiar, that is wrong or absent or empty or whatever it might be.
Well, it's certainly something I think that the whole series, with its, and we'll get into this, I'm sure, emphasis on family and found family, but also just family structures, that it was something, because I rewatched 28 Days Later last night, that it was a recurring thing, this fear of isolation. And it was just very interesting to me how I'm like, wow, you really kind of predicted all the anxieties of COVID decades earlier. But of course, that's key to, that's an underlying theme of the zombie narrative of your friends, your family, you're surrounded by zombies, but you're still isolated. So yeah, that was such a shocking opening scene of that film. And again, that's often things that people remember more than the zombies was the isolation, because that really freaked, I think, people out more in some ways.
Yeah, definitely. So what happens in 28 Days Later, Mary? He wakes up, he's in empty London. We've got that famous shot of him on the bridge. There's rubbish everywhere.
Yeah.
I think it's really interesting. And, we did kind of mention this a little bit in the afterword of our book. He goes into a church. He goes into a Catholic church, and then he's confronted with a priest who has been infected and is essentially a zombie. And there's lots of kind of graffiti about the apocalypse everywhere, and he still doesn't really understand. But I do think that it's interesting that they are putting in this kind of image of the kind of Christian apocalypse here, like in this kind of film, and thinking, because I think a lot of people, in terms of like, how would you actually respond? Some people probably would think this is the end times, and some people might get infected themselves. Yeah. And there's also then, because it's a zombie, and the priest is obviously trying to eat Cillian Murphy, and it's really interesting on that kind of what it's saying about the kind of theological significance of consumption and eating flesh, and that kind of thing.
Yeah,
Cillian Murphy obviously doesn't really know what's happening, scared, leaves the church, manages to escape, and then it comes back to your idea of found family. He does meet up with two people who help him to go back to his parents' house, where he finds them dead. Eventually, it's just him and a woman survivor who's played by Naomi Harris. They end up teaming up with a father and his daughter. They found out there's some radio kind of signals saying, go up north. So they get in a car. It's quite ill-advised, but they get in a car. They go under this tunnel, which is again like I think the tunnel scene is quite scary.
It's one of those great self-aware moments of, this is a bad idea, and you know why? Because it's very obviously a bad idea to get in a car and go into a tunnel. Like, don't do that. Which is something, again, which is sometimes that movie is laugh out loud funny, and which is again just such a, for a horror movie, a bit of a shock, because there's some great, just like non-zombie, this is hilarious, self-aware moments.
Yeah, but somehow they managed to get through the tunnel, and I think there is a little bit of comedy there. They try and change a tire.
Leaving London by car is difficult enough at the best of times.
Yeah. But yeah, they go out, they're driving up north, and then I think you get that kind of contrast of the kind of abandoned London city scene to then the abandoned motorways and the kind of beautiful landscape where there's just no one around. There's no one around, and it's really sparse. And then, Lauren, they end up finally getting to this, the promise, kind of like, this is the place where we're going to find help, and it's a military camp essentially, where where they've been sending out this signal, come here, like we'll there's a barrier they've organized. They're in a kind of big country house, so there's lots of protection, and they've got a kind of way to that they know when zombies are coming onto the land, and they can protect everyone inside. And it seems too good to be true, because it is. And so I think in a very different non-supernatural, non-zombie way, that military part, I think for me is one of the most terrifying bits there, because they're all men, and the I can't remember what his rank is, but the person in charge has essentially promised his men.
He's played by Christopher Eccleston,
Christopher
right?
Eccleston,
it is,
isn't it?
Yeah. He's essentially promised his men that any women or girls that get there, they will be theirs, and they can enjoy themselves or attempt to repopulate Britain in that way. And it's kind of like it's a human kind of violence. You know, zombies essentially, you know, they've been infected by rage virus. They can't help themselves, but these men are choosing to do this violence. So yeah, I mean, I don't know if either of you had any thoughts on that that part of the film.
I think, obviously, again, no one will be shocked by this. I haven't actually seen it, but I have consumed this film in parts over the years. And, you know, of course, this is something that often comes up when we're talking about like military masculinity and military frameworks, that there's such a fine and delicate and often completely unsustainable line between kind of pack violence and, you know, quote unquote legitimized violence. And we see this, you know, I've talked about this a little bit with kind of post Iraq, particularly American media, where it's, you know, how do you know who to pull the trigger on? And, you know, we had true stories of this. We had, you know, platoons and regiments who were shooting civilians because whoever was at the head of that regiment or platoon, it was like, you know, a rite of passage. And you very, very quickly lose your moral compass and lose your individuality when you are indoctrinated into what is essentially a small cult that's part of a large cult. And I think one of the things that makes this film both a horror film and a gothic film is that presence of non-supernatural violence. Because what the gothic has been telling us for generations now is, yes, there's things out there that we can't explain, and, you know, don't, you know, go into the dark forest at night because something bad might happen. But the bad thing that might happen to you could be a man. And that particularly patriarchal societies produce this type of gendered violence. And, you know, that once society breaks down, where does that go, and how does, you know, what is there to manage that? There's nothing to manage that. And this is the kind of violence that happens. So I think that's why you see this in so many post-apocalyptic. You see it in The Road, you see it in Walking Dead, you see it in this, you see it in that one. I can't remember, it's the one where all the electricity gets turned off and they turn into militias. Mad Max, you know, you always see this in these post-apocalyptic narratives because that's one of the big fears. And it's really funny because there's a kind of trend going around on TikTok at the moment of women being like, I would simply unalive myself if the apocalypse happened. Bear. I'd pick the bear. You know, because what am I going to be trying to survive? You know, it's going to be this dialed up to 10,000. So yeah, I think it's really interesting that these particularly zombie narratives choose to do this again and again, and to refocus the fear.
Yeah, I mean, I agree 100%. I think, again, it's interesting for me coming at this from an American, and particularly now as an American who spent some time in Britain, and then went back to the States, because rewatching the film, it again struck me now that I get the references to like Terry's Chocolate Oranges and you know, the motorway and this and that, how much of this full movie is about the end of empire, and then anxieties about futurity. You know, those opening scenes where he's walking through empty London, and they're all the kind of like tourist kitsch toys are on the ground. And I don't think it's an accident that it's an Irish actor that Naomi Harris is there as a kind of, object for soldiers to want, and so from the beginning, you're looking at the end of empire. It's so brutally British. It's so savagely British, but it's Britain post. And it's interesting then that when they get to where the soldiers are, the head of the soldier, Christopher Eccleston, says, "We must be a disappointment because there aren't that many of them, and they're not on the barricade. Where they have set up is a stately home." That again, they're very much anchored in not only Britishness, but a version of Britishness that is now beyond redundant, like beyond, way beyond its usefulness, for sure. And that his argument for, why do we need women? It's because women mean a future. So there's a really interesting poet actually who did a collection of poems on final girls, and the collection is called I Am Not Your Final Girl. And she did a poem on 28 Days Later, and I can't remember her name right now, of course, but it was a very interesting one because again, it speaks to this idea that the whole idea of empire is that it has to be self-perpetuating, and that even at the end of the world, even when we're so far past the idea of Britain as empire, we still have soldiers. We still have all male soldiers who are trying to enforce gender boundaries, who are trying to enforce racial boundaries. Again, they have a zombie pet, basically a soldier who's been infected, who is Black. And again, there are all these subtle things of this is empire. This is how we manage these things. And that it's just such a, there's an underlying joke to it almost of what a pointless exercise. Mm-hmm. Let's get them dressed up before we sexually assault them. Let's make sure that they're wearing these nice clothes. And let's make it seem civilized. Let's do it in this stately home. Let's have all these empty trappings of empire and by extension, patriarchal masculinity. But then, and yes, I was rewatching it last night and I'm like, man, these are better villains than the zombies are.
Yeah.
I am
it's kind of the point, isn't it?
Yes. By the very sleazy soldiers and the very sleazy soldier leader. And by the end, the zombies have actually been weaponized against the soldiers in a way that almost makes the zombies the good guys. Mm-hmm. And to the kind of climactic fight, there is no line really between the infected and the non-infected, mm-hmm. All of which again then come up in the 28 years later thing. So yeah, I won't jump ahead to that, but I did think it was interesting that again, it's the new movie is different. It takes a very different approach to what I do think are the same anxieties and issues, and breaking down what patriarchal masculinity is and what empire is and the British relationship with empire. And from an American perspective, I did apply that to an American end of empire conversation. And also to anxieties of futurity, like this is the end of the world.
What's really interesting is this is the anxiety about empire from the very beginning. So mm-hmm. from the early 18th century, you have a consistent anxiety about standing armies and what do standing armies represent? Because if you have a large standing army, you've got men trained to violence and nowhere for them to expend that violence. And the whole idea is like, oh, well, in the age of chivalry, they jousted. And the reason that they did jousts and tourneys and hunts was because they had to be constantly trained to violence, but there needed to be a way for that violence to be like, quote unquote, positively, enjoyed, or expelled, whatever it might be. And there's this constant thing of like, well, we have to have a big standing army for an empire. But then if there's no one to go to war with, where will these men be violent?
Yeah.
And that is like from the very beginnings of the British Empire, this anxiety about these men trained to violence. And obviously the way that the British Empire deals with that is that they're not kept in Britain.
Yeah.
The soldiers are not kept in Britain. They are kept in the West Indies. They are kept in India. They are kept in Africa, and they are committing violence, but they're committing violence to people that the quote unquote real Britons can't see. Then when you get to like the end of Empire, and all of a sudden you've got why have you got all these soldiers? Why are all these soldiers? Why are there so many soldiers, and what are they going to do? You've trained them to violence. You've trained them to this, hyper masculine patriarchal standard. And now what? And it's that kind of reminding you that they're not individual villains. They are victims of the system in the same way that like everybody else is, and the system itself is the villain. And it is that Gothic narrative again of like, actually, the ghost isn't the bad thing. The ghost isn't the villain. The villain is this thing that is higher above all of us, that we are, like it or not, being forced to participate in. And I think from what I know about the new film that comes up again. So, Mary, how does this one end, and how do we go into the less lauded sequel?
Which does still have the military in it.
Oh, it has more military.
Some would say too much.
Yeah. This one ends I realize I didn't actually say spoilers at the start of this episode. We'll make sure that there's like a spoiler announcement in the description, and just, this film is like over 20 years old. So you have had a chance to watch it. But apologies if you weren't expecting to be spoiled. One thing that I do think really it demonstrates both of what you've been saying is that the army people, there's one guy who is essentially cooking for them in this kind of stately home, and he puts on like a frilly kind of very feminine kind of apron, because it's like, of course, like there are roles. You are a military man, or cooking is feminine and it's for women. So it's like, we're making fun of this, and they make fun of him, and he kind of, he puts on a bit of a campy kind of display, and it's very much like you say, it's the decline of empire and people not really understanding what they can do. But with that, so the film ends, spoiler, I guess, Cillian Murphy and Naomi Harris both survive, with the little girl that they picked up. Her dad unfortunately died, but it's the three of them. And again, it's, I guess, similar to the Trippids. They end up in a kind of cottage, and they're trying to write a message so that someone in a plane will see them. And then that's kind of where we leave them. We have been told that Cillian Murphy will return, so we can come back to Cillian Murphy later. But I don't really want to spend a lot of time on this for reasons that will become apparent. But in 2007, there is a sequel called 28 Weeks Later. So, okay, have either of you seen this?
No, I barely even remember it coming out.
Yeah.
I saw it, but I think I saw it when it came out, and I don't think I rewatched it after that.
No.
I was entertained, I guess, by it, but I remember almost nothing about it.
So let's just, I think it's interesting, but I don't think we need to do a deep dive into it. So Danny Boyle and Alex Garland were not really attached to this film. It was directed by Juan Carlos Fresnadillo, and the screenplay was written by Rowan Joffe, Juan Carlos Fresnadillo, E.L. Levin, and Jesus Olmo. And if there are multiple screenwriters attached to a film, that's generally not a good kind of sign.
Unless they're a unit known for producing, it's not usually a good thing.
I also feel like if you have to shoehorn Americans in it to try to appeal to an American market, because the Americans can't be trusted to watch it if there isn't an American in it, then that's probably not a good sign.
Exactly. So the plot of this film is essentially, again, it's 28 weeks after the initial outbreak. The outbreak has been contained to Britain, so the rest of the world is fine, which again, I think is why it's a really interesting kind of franchise that speaks to kind of everything that's wrong with Britain and a specific kind of British horror. And now the outbreak has been kind of contained a little bit. They think that they think that the zombies have a kind of shelf life, and that the zombies have then died, so that they think it's safe to go back. So there is a UN relief effort that is being run by the US military, because of course, who are kind of in charge, and they have a kind of zone in London that they are then bringing back refugees, British refugees, which I just think is actually quite interesting to kind of think about in terms of, you know, Britain is one of those countries that has such a horrific relationship to anti-immigration and refugees, and I think in a way that doesn't really appreciate that we as a country contribute so much to the causes of those immigrants, that I think it's interesting that Britain is now one of those countries. You know, Britain is a displaced population living in lots of different countries, and here is some refugees that are coming back to a devastated landscape. And it focuses on one family, and you see at the beginning there's a father and his wife, and just coincidentally their children are on a kind of foreign exchange school trip, so they're not in the country. But it's a father and a wife. They're living with another family. It's kind of in the middle of this, you know, zombie rage virus, and the house that they're in gets overrun. There's a bit where the wife is trying to save herself and a little boy that they're living with. The father kind of looks at them, thinks, no, it's actually quite a horrible thing. He's like, do you know what? No, I'm going to save myself. He runs and leaves. And then there's a horrible scene where his wife, you can see her looking out of a window of this house. He looks back and he sees her, and then he just carries on running. He saves himself. He leaves his wife, who wanted to protect this young boy, essentially to the zombies. So he is in Britain, and then his two children are part of this refugee kind of population that comes back.
Sort of diaspora.
Yeah. He tells them that he did everything he could to save their mother. It's very traumatic. I think they believe his story. And part of this, part of the kind of UN kind of machinery.
Relief effort?
Yeah, relief effort. There is a medical doctor called Scarlett, who's played by Rose Byrne. And she's kind of doing some of the sciencey stuff. And then you have Jeremy Renner playing someone called Doyle, who is a Delta Force sniper.
Sure, that American in there.
Of course, it's Jeremy Renner.
I know. Yeah. I mean, it's almost as surprising as that time that he did a kind of guest episode in Angel.
Yeah.
But
why not?
Yeah.
Oh dear.
But yeah, before he was Hawkeye, he was a Delta Force sniper who was sniping, you know, zombies and this kind of thing.
You just slap a military uniform on Jeremy Renner, you're good to go.
Oh, call it a day.
Yeah.
So the thing that starts to unravel, and I think, given that you have all of these, you know, this military kind of presence and snipers who are meant to be, you know, so at the moment they're trying to keep these refugees in this certain area. Don't go into the rest of London because we're still clearing it up. But these two kids are like, yeah, no, like our house is like in that area, so we're going to go. So they manage to sneak out, like quarantine. Like, do you not know what an effective quarantine is?
But as we've learned, I have to say, post 2020, a lot of these narratives that I used to think were unrealistic, I now think, no, people do shit like that.
Yeah.
Like, people do stupid shit like that.
Yes, but this film takes that to infuriating levels of incompetence. So these kids are in London, and then you get the kind of the scenes that we had with Cillian Murphy in the first film, where London is, you see the devastation, and also now you have rotting corpses because they've been there for 28 weeks. So it's not just kind of London is a a wasteland, but it's filled with all these rotten corpses and half-eaten limbs and rubbish and stuff. They manage to go back to the house, and does anyone want to guess who they find at their house?
Their mother is a zombie.
Mother.
Yes, their mother. But this is what's interesting. So she is infected, but she's a carrier, but she's not actually violent or aggressive.
Like asymptomatic.
Yeah, exactly. So she is a carrier of this rage virus. Everyone else that they know, all the other zombies are dead. She is alive. She's carrying the virus, but she's not, she's not herself symptomatic. And so there is the potential for a cure. So they get back. Obviously the kids are angry because they're like, what the fuck? This is, what did you do? Did you really check?
Failed patriarchal masculinity again.
The medical people are, like, wow, we could maybe get a cure for this, and we can, this is really interesting, and how do we get all this stuff? Again, quarantine. Somehow the dad manages to get in to see her. Don't know how. Surely she should be massively guarded.
He's just riding the wave of that guilt straight through those doors.
He should not be in there. Like, no one is guarding her door. Like, this is apparently the only person left that is infected and carrying this, horrific disease that has killed like the majority of Britain, and could potentially spread to other places. He gets in there.
Guard.
He gets in there, and obviously she manages to bite him because
I would.
Yeah, same. And then he becomes infected, and then he gets loose in this supposed to be quarantine zone. They also are not very good at kind of recognizing that, and their quarantine practice is bad. They soon realize that, oh shit, there's like now that, because he then starts biting other people, and it just escalates so quickly. And you're like, why was this building not contained? Why was the room not contained? He manages to get out. They're hurting all of these people. And then eventually this order comes down to the military being like, we
just bomb them all.
Yeah, essentially, we're gonna.
So where that was going.
Everyone get out. Everyone get out. This is a lost cause. We're just gonna have to kill everyone that's here because obviously, So the rest of the film is Jeremy Renner and the doctor who realizes that the son of this woman also has potentially the same kind of genetic makeup. There's something with their eyes. And she's like, this boy must survive. So it's Jeremy Renner and this doctor and these two kids trying to get out while there's all these zombies, and then also
so it's Jurassic Park.
The US military trying to kill them.
I was going to say, this is. I'm starting to realize why I don't remember any of this, because it's kind of following all the same pitfalls of a lot of zombie movies.
Yeah.
Here's a completely kind of unrealistic containment process. Here's savior kid, here's, and yeah, I think the reason the first movie stood out, because it didn't do any of that really. It was, yeah.
It could have been really interesting. And the setup with the family was interesting. And, I guess it is something like...
and the idea of an evolving disease where there are asymptomatic characters is interesting, particularly post-COVID. Yeah.
And I think as well, like, obviously, as we get to 28 years later, they do manage to mutate to survive longer. And is that part of this mutation? They don't really touch on... They don't really touch on 28 weeks later in the kind of the latest film, which I think is a good idea. There is one thing at the end. They managed to get the kids on a chopper.
This I do remember, yeah.
Yeah, they get, and I think maybe one of them is infected. I think one of them is infected, and they're going to France. So
down with the French.
Good luck, France.
Again,
once again, Britain has to drag down France with it.
Well, I felt like, that movie did work on that premise that was introduced in the first movie, that eventually, because of the nature of the virus, the infected can't sustain themselves. like they can't feed themselves, they can't do anything. So they will eventually, this will fix itself in time, because eventually they'll starve to death. And again, obviously within a discourse on empire, the idea of starving a population is particularly horrifying, but that there is an idea of, oh, okay, well, actually there's a solution, which is they'll just die out, which obviously then, we ignore completely. And 28 years later, where they've evolved, which I think would be it is kind of a more interesting premise.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We should move on to that, because that is by far the more interesting film.
Yes.
Okay.
I would recommend to anyone, if you want to watch it for a complete franchise kind of, completion thing, then watch it. But also, if you want to just go from like 28 days later to 28 years later, that's also fine.
That's feels like the director's continuity.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
Because Danny Boyle
And
and
then
Alex
ignore half of
Garland.
that movie because it doesn't matter. Like, yes for continuity, but not even really for continuity, since
Thanks for listening to part 1 of our review of the 28 Days Later horror franchise. Stay tuned for part 2, coming soon.
And of course, if you have enjoyed this episode, please drop us a like and a subscribe on whatever platform it might be that you are watching or listening to us on. And if you would like to let us know what upcoming films, games, books it would be that you'd like us to review in the future, let us know.